Good evening. Is this working? Can you hear?
Yeah.
Yes. Today I looked in the dictionary to see if there would be a word that was a good word for welcome or for greeting or to greet, because we are very fortunate to have the Masakis who are at our door, and I wanted a special word for the word greet. And as I looked in the dictionary, my eyes fell on the second definition of the word greet, and it was a Scottish word that meant to grieve, to mourn. And I thought somehow that instead of saying welcome, I would say, we greet you, we are pleased that you are here. It has been 45 years since the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. In that time, a new fear entered all our lives, and I think has lived with us in that space of time. I think this year, for the first time, all of us may look with more hope on the possibility of a peaceful world, because both the United States and the Soviet Union are making true attempts to approach a way of peace. So on this day that we remember the 92,000 people who died in an instant, we also must look to hope in the hope of a new peaceful world. And I thank all of you for being here because I know that all of our hearts have that wish for peace. I also hope that we will continue to search for peace, because there is still the problem of nuclear waste disposal. There is the problem of our oceans being contaminated by nuclear waste. And we must all be concerned because nuclear waste remains in drums on this earth. And this earth is for us and for the children who follow us. We need to also consider the testing of bombs, because we truly do not know what it means to test these bombs upon this earth. So though we look forward to peace, we must consider ways of renewing our struggle for that. This evening, we have with us Kiyoko Sakamoto Nosker, who will play for us her koto. Following, Eric Selland will read from his own poetry and from the poetry of post-war Japanese poets. I think that this may be a first in Fresno that this may happen. So I welcome you to this evening of commemoration for Hiroshima.
back. That was wonderful. I'm Chuck Moulton, director of the Fresno Poets Association, and it's nice to see so many new faces here tonight. Some of you might know it, but might not know it, but Fresno is one of the most important poetry centers in the western United States. In fact, one of the poetry centers of the United States. Fresno poets have won more than 70 national prizes in the last couple of decades, prizes that are synonymous with careers in teaching English. And Fresno has produced about 35 English professors that teach at universities. One of the things the Poets Association has managed to do over the past 8 years is to bring back most of the Fresno poets, not all of them yet, but most of them, and those that have made, at least those who have made their mark in the literary world. Tonight we're completing one of our goals by bringing Eric Selland back to Fresno to read. Eric is both a translator and a poet. I'm not a translator, but it occurs to me that the transformation of meaning from English to Japanese, or from Japanese to English, especially with regard to poetry, seems more than just a craft. There must be some relationship between being a translator and being a cat burglar, springing across the rooftops, feeling the tumble of jewels in your pocket, or a bird in flight with prey in its mouth, feeling the pull of the earth, or an angel with a harp falling to earth, starting to repeat itself, making judgments, decisions, finding fault, finding oneself compelled to take the next step in the formation of meaning, realizing that in order to be well received, one must be a superior criminal. One must also tune in on the schemes of others. Eric was born in Fresno, 1957. He attended the University of Japan, or universities in Japan, completed his study of Japanese language and culture at San Francisco State University. While at San Francisco State, he apprenticed himself to the poet Michael Palmer, at the same time receiving inspiration and guidance from Robert Duncan. Selland has spent 7 years living and working in Japan, where he translated numerous Japanese poets, the most important of these being Ashioka Minaru, a major figure in Japanese post-war avant-garde poetry. The relationship with the Ashioka had a profound effect on him, on his own life and work, which is now associated most closely with the new lyric, a term recently coined by the Canadian Magazine of Experimental Writing. Selland's first book, Preface, was published by Tells Press in Tokyo in 1985. His poems and translations have appeared in a variety of small magazines in North America, Europe, Japan. He has an upcoming publication of translations of Yoshioka Minaru's poetry from Leach Books in Vancouver, British Columbia. Eric Selland now lives in San Francisco and works as an independent translator of Japanese business and technical materials. It is interesting to note that Selland was exposed to Asian study by his mother, who was a student of Asian culture, and that he began his studies of Japanese language at the age of 14 at the Fresno Buddhist Temple. As a high school student, he attended readings of the Fresno poet professors Robert Mazzi, Philip Levine, C.G. Hanzlicek, Peter Everwine, all of California State University, Fresno. Of his own work, Selland has said, "I have an interest in musical form and in bringing together diverse elements in the poem." He is attempting to make a multicultural poetry, both in terms of poetics and theme. Naturally, translation becomes an important part here in all that that might infer. There is also a pervading concern with time and memory. And he has put quotation to use, as do many of his contemporaries. Eric Selland is a poet of great intensity, highly eclectic, abounding in variety, risk, exploration, and unlimited potentialities. He's published quite internationally his poems, essays, translations, and I'd name them all, but I can't pronounce all those names. I'm anxious to hear Eric get up and read. Would you mind coming up here and reading to Selland?
Thank you. Jacqueline mentioned that this might be a first in Fresno. I think it's a first on the West Coast. I haven't read any Japanese translations in San Francisco yet. So I'm happy to be here. I enjoyed hearing the little soliloquy on translation. I was just thinking about all of this while listening to Chidori no Kyoku. By the way, I have all the pieces Kyoko's performing tonight. I have performed at one time in my life on the shakuhachi, which I would not dare try to do again tonight. It's been many years since I did anything of that sort. But so those are very familiar things to me too. Also, something one wouldn't really be. Something like that really wouldn't be headed as the entertainment at something like this in Japan. That would be very unusual to do something traditional of that sort. It's not at all common, so it's something very special. Another thing about translation, I was thinking I don't know how many technical translators think philosophically about their doing. I don't think they have time. They have to make money. You're paid by the word, how many words you can get out a day. But to me, whenever I look into these translations, there's all these words that really have no translation. Sure, you could explain them. You could write hundreds of pages of anthropological theses about what they mean, but there really is no translation because it's a totally different culture, a totally different mindset, different history. So every time you gaze into, especially something like a poem, a Japanese poem, you're gazing into the void. So there's no meaning. What is it that creates the meaning? You don't know. And you have to end up creating that yourself while you're translating the poem. Speaking of Hiroshima, it may be one of the series. There's a whole series of mistakes, of miscommunication that led, well, of course, to the beginning of World War II, but also to the final dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. One of those was a mistranslation of the Japanese answer to the American warning that if the Japanese did not surrender immediately within a few days, then they would drop this horrible new weapon on their cities. And the Japanese answered back a word which basically means, well, give us some time. It was translated as absolutely not. And so, boom. So beware, translators. But generally, I think people usually think of, in the States, I mean, actually, quite a lot of people know at least something about haiku. But it's interesting to note that that's not really the genres of haiku and modern poetry are really very different genres. As a matter of fact, they don't connect at all. The people in the respective genres don't speak to one another. And if one is a haiku who experiments a bit too much or does something a bit unconventional, then they especially don't speak to you. You get dumped from the modern paperback haiku collection, which appears yearly. Most of the haikuists I'm interested in are people who have been dumped, basically. So a lot of very adventurous people, with the exception of actually one person. People who have had quite a lot of communication with the modern poets and with a lot of new ideas that came in the 20th century. So the word for poetry in Japanese, the word which would be translated as poetry is shi. A term which was originally used to describe Chinese poetry. In other words, shi is something which is foreign, which is imported, which is brought in. It's a foreign form. All of Japanese poetry, when we think of post-war Japanese poetry, all of 20th century Japanese poetry is directly influenced by Western poetry, especially French and German. One of the problems I've had with some translations of modern Japanese poetry is that a lot of the American academics translating the poetry, whether it's because their own disinterest or unfamiliarity with modern poetry in English, or whether it possibly because they are basically Anglophiles, they're unable to accept the very strong surrealist influence on most of 20th century Japanese poetry. And so things are smoothed out, things are made conventional, linear, and so you lose a lot of the flavor of the poetry. It's interesting that a lot of the best loved, even popular poets who were taught in elementary school, were like, say one Nakahara Chuya was the first Japanese Dadaist. And a lot of his poems are really sound poems. It's rather difficult to translate them because basically it's the sound that you want to hear. You lose that once it's in a different language. This is the poetry I've been very interested in. I love the classics also, of course, but this is something I've loved since I was in college, and that's what really got me to be involved in poetry. So I have two haikuists and a poet. Both of the haikuists are fairly experimental. The first Saito Sanki was writing before and during the war. He was one of a group of poets who were they were not nearly as experimental as some later people like Takayanagi Jushin, who was totally wild, just words all over the page, this way and that way, and this was his haiku, and totally shocked the Japanese haiku world. Not quite that far, but basically he was doing things like dropping the seasonal words and so on. Haiku has certain very conventional rules. You always have to have a word at some point in the poem which will tell you what the season is. And there's a whole series of conventions of these sorts, and Saito Sanki decided to drop these conventions. This is what he was doing during World War II, and he was arrested by the thought police for writing a haiku without seasonal words. This was radical, you know. Maybe the guy's a communist, you know. Who knows? He's not using seasonal words. You never can tell. He spent a number of years in prison and was finally released. They decided it wasn't worth keeping around. And one of the conventions he broke was the convention of subject. He did things like he wrote during the war. He wrote about the war, which was something which was just taboo. You don't say what's really going on. You're not supposed to mention these things. Hiroshima at night. Distant voices explode with laughter. No moon, no stars. Hiroshima with the hard ground. Night coming on, onion heads, many and countless. There's something I should mention before going on. These translations are by a very good friend of mine named Masaya Saito, no relation to Saito-san, who has also translated Saito's autobiographical novel, and which is not yet published. It's very difficult to publish poetry of any sort in the United States right now, but especially translations. A black man enters an iron ship, nightfall in winter. Hiroshima, to eat a boiled egg, the mouth wide open. An air raid drill, caressing her moonlit fingers. The anniversary of Hiroshima, encrusted with sand grains, the swimming tube. A machine gun, eating its scatters cartridges. The soldiers depart in a black ship. The war dead report, made into a bag for ripening an apple. A machine gun, the low moon, round and resounding. In a trench, huge eye holes of he who remains. A war horse runs on iron shoes that spark in the darkness. A machine gun, in the middle of the forehead, a red flower blooms. Crawling in a trench, an insect comes to rest in my hand. Here's one I hadn't noticed when I was looking for things to read. Harpo Marx, who was born from God's excrement. That's bizarre. I'm going to have to read this. It's pretty much what it says in Japanese, more or less. The other thing is that he has the Japanese, he's written the Japanese here under the translations, and of course, I mean, I think he's done a good job on his translations, but being a translator, I look at the Japanese and say, oh, well, you could do this way. I say, well, no, I would do it this way, because the thing is, there's 100 ways to translate these things. You could just translate any way, almost. It's amazing, especially because of the simplicity. A machine gun bullet still in his body at graduation. On the Mona Lisa, the animation of a golden beetle suspended forever. This one I think is wonderfully ironic. I think this was probably just after the war, I would assume. A packet of cigars bearing a picture of the diet building has increased in price. the Diet building, the parliament, the Japanese parliament building in Tokyo. It's just, when you stop to think about this, it's incredibly ironic. A packet of cigars bearing a picture of the Diet building has increased in price. Collector's item. Cannon booms, I count them, ice melting on my tongue. Yes, I think that is what I have this side. Actually, there really isn't much political poetry in Japan. The Japanese don't like to make huge statements or comments. They don't like causes like Americans do. Americans are very, very excited about causes of various sorts. The Japanese are much more quiet about that. And in a sense, it's probably why Saito, simply by doing something a little bit different, simply by mentioning the fact that there are machine guns and insinuating that maybe it's not so good, that got him into prison. All you had to do was just insinuate. Of course, a lot can be said simply by insinuating in Japanese. It's not a direct statement, it's a roundabout statement. Another haikuist I became interested in is Nagata Koi, who's now 90 years old. He did not really begin his career as a haikuist until he was 60. He was writing, of course, all the time up until then, but he didn't really get started with his own school of haiku and publishing and all that. So virtually his whole career, all of his best work has been written as a very old man. It's just something like very much. He's very much the embodiment of the I don't know how many people are familiar with the no drama in Zeami, and the ideal, according to the no drama, is the old actor. The older actor, through doing this, through working through the form for many years, one finally reaches perfection. So it's the elderly person is the ideal, not youth, not the young person. There's not instant overnight success, which is admired in the States. It's someone who's done something for years and years. Nagata's haiku are very influenced by Buddhist philosophy, by the writings of Dogen, the Buddhist philosopher, and are extremely simple. They're like the simple statements. It's more like an object in itself. It's not an image. It's not a comment on an object. It itself is a thing. So they're even simpler in a sense. He's really a radical classicist rather than a avant-gardist, but he is not really thought of all that kindly by the more conventional haikuist because of the things he does. I'll read this first haiku in Japanese also. 腐りつつある白雪の腐木かな Driftwood on the rotting snow. Shaft of sunlight, suddenly absurd, the sleeping Buddha. Near death, laughing at the plum trees. The reclining Buddha overgrown with bamboo leaves. Dusk brings waking from nap's dream. Cutting grass, the nightshade tilts, spring moon. Lifting its tail, the earth darkens, spring sparrow. Winter clouds become one, then half. The body's existence drags on, baby's breath. Moonrise, like a leftover seed in Inamino. Inamino is a place in Hyogo Prefecture, near Osaka, in that general area in southern Honshu. The pain of flower viewing is in the body, in the flower. A last chrysanthemum plays in the world's machinations. Embarrassed, it goes, becomes distant, autumn's end. A winter day appears at the grave of one gone. In the fullness of old times, a winter fly. New Year's Day, 3 cakes dried up, dead, thinned out. Field of frost. Is this field of frost? I, a youth of 80. When Nagata talks about frost, Shimo, he's talking about gray hair, about age. Old woman gives rice paste, then passes. Bridge of frost. Autumn rain. Evening walks into a man's mouth. And this is a poem that's very special to me because it's the one that he wrote. He wrote down for me on a little notepad when I visited him in Kobe, where he lives. He had just written that day, April 17th, 1988. This describes his experience as a child playing in the fields in spring when the fields were still fallow. They had not yet planted the rice yet, and he would play in the irrigation ditches and so on. And so he has an image of the irrigation ditch. So in the Japanese, it's Kyakusen ga boshun karamizu kara nutto. Feet stuck out of bare irrigation ditch at spring's end. The last word, the fun thing about this poem is the last word, nutto, is an onomatopoeic word which just means just means pushing it up. And so he's just describing the physical gesture of sticking the feet out of the irrigation ditch. This is something you wouldn't find in a haiku very often. It's something from, colloquial speech, from an onomatopoeia one might use in describing something to someone in regular speech. So that's it's also very difficult to figure out how to translate because it's just the description of a gesture. It's not, a word in a sense. And then something from his more recent collection. There's an interesting series. I think I'll read both of these versions of the translation. when I first read this next haiku, a translation immediately came to me, just sprung from that. I wrote it down, and later when I reread the original, I realized that I had made a mistake, so I retranslated it. But the mistake is so interesting that I'm going to read the mistake also, and then the corrected version. There's actually 3 versions. I'll read 2 of them. The Japanese is Shiraume no yohaku no yome ware. Shiraume no yohaku no yome ware ni ari. Excessive whiteness of white plum, its overflow of life in me. Which turned out to be incorrect, but white spaces on white plum, what remains of life for me. But take either one you prefer. I liked the mistake so much I couldn't bear to deal with reality there. But Koi is very interested in the object of one of his main collections is entitled Bushitsu, which means object or material, stuff, things are made of. It's his Zen Buddhism, of course, reality, daily reality, and so on. I'm very interested in the materialness of things of existence. These things are dangerous. Spring wind that is flesh, it's passing. Scent of rice paste seems stuck to them, old man and old woman. Spring's morning twilight moves over both shores, is gone. Spring wind with red snappers, a school of fisherwomen. These and also the Sanki poems are going to appear shortly after a long delay in a magazine, which a friend of mine was publishing in Paris, and will be available instead from Stephen Forth, who's publishing Leech Books in Vancouver. If anybody in Fresno wants to get a hold of any of these things, the magazine, you can probably contact Chuck and he can contact me. I don't think any of these things will be in bookstores. The magazine is just by subscription only. Maybe I'll read a couple of my haiku. I was very much against doing any haiku for a long time because I had just, I was very involved with the recent avant-garde, and most of the recent haiku I had come across was very conventional, and I wasn't interested in it. And everyone gets into haiku, and I thought, well, come on, let's do something different for once. But then I ran across Nagata Koi and some others, and became quite fascinated with what they were doing, and since then I've been more involved. And I've written a couple myself. One which I wrote one evening while I was babysitting my son, and he suddenly laughed in his sleep, and this just came to me. So, laughter and sleep, the mind's gift, child spring. and then something that was this has a title, On the Way to the Crematorium, Pure White Crane Above the Rice Field, which was written upon the death of a friend. After the funeral, on the way to the crematorium, there was a white crane gliding across the rice fields, which I imagined to be carrying her soul back to the Adriatic, where she had assured us she was going after her death. Another one. Straw fires spew rust-colored smoke over the fields. Autumn. Early summer rain gives sheen to gathering of black coats. Smoke curls upward from incense bowl. I think I'll go on to the main poet I've been interested in over the years, Yoshioka Minoru. Yoshioka just died very recently. That one haiku was actually written at his funeral, the Black Coat poem. Yoshioka was born in 1919. He only had an elementary school education, but has written some of the most difficult poetry of his generation in terms of usage of the Chinese character and various other things. He also started his career as about very late. He was drafted into the Imperial Army at age, I think around 18 or 20 or so. Interestingly enough, one of the things he brought with him to the induction center was, this was just a very short while after all foreign literature, all foreign language and literature of all sorts had been banned. Anyone reading foreign books would be arrested, or at least questioned or suspicion of various activities. But, I don't know if it was out of naivete or if it was just some way of his own way of rebelling or what, but Yoshioka arrived at the induction center of the Imperial Army with a copy of the poems of Arthur Rimbaud under his arm. It's a great anecdote. He has never said what it was he had on his mind when he did that, but they just took it away from him. They didn't punish him. He spent the war in Manchuria and then a number of years in a Russian prison camp after the war. So he really got started published his first work when he was 40 years old. I have translated his collection of poems called Kusudama. The word kusudama, which I chose not to translate in the book, is actually a large, brightly colored paper mache decoration, an object of sorts that sort of round and with all sorts of frills or some bright colors that would have been, in the old days, would have been outside of a new store that was opening up, or perhaps was advertising at some sort of an event, perhaps, or a festival. One of the things you would have seen in the area of Tokyo called Shitamachi, the what would you call it? It's literally translated as downtown. It doesn't mean downtown. It's sort of like the other side of the tracks, in a sense. That was where he grew up, and it was something that he would have seen in his youth. The characters, however, are written, the kusu means medicine, and tama is ball, so it means medicine ball. And if you think of that in, say, Native American terms, it's something which, well, it's a medicine ball, it has medicine in it, so there's all sorts of things, and they're magic, all kinds of things, stories, myths, and so on. Another meaning of the word tama is soul, or spirit. And it's the same tama in another word that's important to Yoshioka is kotodama, which is the spirit of words. It was believed at one time in Japan's history in ancient times that certain words had certain magical characteristics inherent in them, and that there were literally spirits, tiny gods attached to them, and that if one uttered these words, it could be very dangerous. It could be there could be a good effect if it was done right by someone who knew what they were doing, but it could also have a dangerous effect. So that, who knows, maybe that's one of the reasons why his Japanese culture developed in a way where people believe that one should keep quiet, because words are dangerous. But they're also alive and have that kind of beauty and that strength and meaning that comes from that, but they're alive, they're not just dead things on the page. Yoshioka has collected all sorts of information, subject matter in the poems. He's quoted a lot. He's brought in Japanese myth and Western myth, Greek myth, a whole range of things of his interests. It circles a lot around the goddess. The mother appears in the poem quite a bit. The mother. And the first poem here is Rooster. He quotes a line from the classics here, which describes a myth where the sun goddess was angry about, the writer thinks she was angry about how her brother was acting, and so she hid in a cave and stuck herself in by putting a huge stone in front of the cave and said, "I'm not coming out." The darkness, came upon the earth, and everyone got upset. Said, "Come on, you've got to come out of the cave. What are we going to do without you?" And he said, "I'm never coming out." So they had to have a ritual in order to coax her out. What the ritual was a woman, well, actually a miko, a shamaness, danced and took off her clothes and shook her breasts in front of the cave and did a nude dance in front of the cave, and then everyone started laughing. And then she peeked out of the cave, and they put a mirror up to the cave. She could see the mirror, and then she came out. There's some interesting symbolism there, but this line is from that one of the lines here is from that myth. The rising sun beyond the top of the pines is like a picture scroll of popular music, calls to mind a line from the mythical accounts. Collect the birds of sudden darkness and make them sing. Bring the goddess out. Rooster that walks, rooster that sleeps. Upon observing, the powerful figure undoubtedly holds slime, slender tubes and feathers collecting, gold claws and dynamos, imitations. On the earth of straw and annihilation of living things, the somersaulting cock tells the time. Rushes at the water's edge sway, and the jar of jam breaks. Spring that quivers in the diaphragm. Hairpins fall from the jet black hair of mothers and daughters. Make ready the cooking knives and camphor. Inside a hut, dreamed while napping. Ready the chamber pot for father on the moss. A meditative darkness. The blacksmith's bellows, womb, contracts. Chicken pecking at vegetables. Chicken that lays an egg. Is this a world of grace? In the cornfields, on the icy peaks, the men are fighting far away. Brightness of the sparks. Without looking up at the empty sky, like a hen strangled. The women straddle an open grave and give a difficult birth. Things abundantly dispersed. Types of seeds and dried leaves. And now some feathers, like amulets, dance lightly up in the watery sky of evening. Something else actually is, that I might mention is that most poets do not read their poetry out loud in Japan. Poetry is not to be read out loud. There's a couple of exceptions amongst modern poets. The exception in the classic is this, that there is a form of singing the classic poems. But basically, once Japan's ancient oral tradition disappeared, it really disappeared. It was totally taken over completely by a sense of the poem as being written, being on the page. It's in the character. And so, of course, when you read a poem, the written character is essential, except for those poets who decide to use a very simple language, to use the syllabary instead of the Chinese character, and so on. And there were probably various reasons for doing that. But a lot of poets, including Yoshioka, for them the character is very important. And there are a lot of visual puns, the use of characters within the same line or very close together, which have some of the same parts, the same radical, and then there's sort of a visual rhyme to the characters. The reason that word is there is because the character looks similar. Of course, you lose this in translation. It's usually considered that one of the tasks of the poet is to bring old words and old characters back to life. You use things that aren't used in say, in the newspaper or in daily speech or in daily writing. To use something unusual or something older, and that also has a special meaning. If you use a different form of the character, you could have the same character, but it's an older form, the unsimplified form, then that has something special about it. It feels different. It would be translated the same, but it's different if you read it in Japanese. So all this is really untranslatable. It's simply lost in the translation. So I'm doing something that Yoshioka would never do. He would never read his poetry out loud. He would scoff at people. There are a couple of people who do wonderful performances of poetry in Japanese. Shiraishi Kazuko and a number of people like that. Shiraishi has been translated by Kenneth Rexroth. She was one of the Beats. I talk about this. She's still alive, still performing with her glittery makeup and glittery outfits and so on. Besides these poets, most people don't read, and Yoshioka himself would scoff at that. So, reading a poetry out loud, that's not the real thing. So it's very different than most American poets' sense of poetry. Most people feel their poetry should be read aloud at some point in the States. There's another pilgrimage. I passed two women in the hall. One is straddling a tricycle. definitely my little sister, reading several pages out of a red book, a biography of a great man, with numerous descriptions of oranges and tomatoes. The other is my mother grown fat, mounted atop a scale. The interior, dressed in cheap clothing, is drenched, and flowing from there are literary style, dead bodies, and a tapeworm. It is said in the family precepts, the sheets have never been soiled with blood or impurities, eternally a landscape of snow. Does the subject become clear at the moment my father loads up a cart with large objects and leaves town? The artillery smoke hangs overhead. Is it a battleship made of mortar fire or a granite peak? The troops continue the assault during the flash of glory. A man's insides could be seen. Flowering plants are torn up, clothing torn, and hair. On top of the shining plate, all the parts of the body are dismantled, and the souls of the dead take the shape of stars. If that which is possible does occur, then let it be so. If what cannot happen does not happen, so be it. Cicada showered midday, inserted with foreign matter. Mother, 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 whole, sister, sister, sister. The wild goose flies west. If you must ask where this place is, it is the earthly paradise. Peach and plum bloom wildly, and there are pearls. Birds and other animals repeatedly call my name and call to my mother. Soldiers prefer wild boars, and old people various goblins. A ravine is cut in the mountains, and the fresh water flows home. The days pass. The newt remains. My little sister bathes in the river and is clothed in froth, and like a cuckoo, continues to search for the ideal master, praising a world of change in the arts and in thought. Smoke rises, a state of forgetfulness. What image carved in the eye of the rhinoceros? Masculine things, fire and air, and things poetic, poetry itself. Feminine things, water and earth, and things near to love, love itself. The stars glitter. The spider hatches its eggs with its own eyes. The poet crawls upon the ground, pours flowing blood from his head. I was present at my sister's birth, poetry's advent. This evening a cool wind passes, and the papers rustle prosaically. Then from the land of scarlet autumn leaves, carrying a bucket of night soil, a man resembling myself crosses a bridge and boards a ship for Damascus, far away and in dead of night. He goes round and round the world of marble and watches a flea jump, like a line in a poem, covered in disgrace. And here is second childhood, that nuclear place at chaotic dawn, where stems of millet catch fire, corpses of people, dogs and cats. Frost falls to the earth without a sound. Describe this in exclamatory mode. Pheasants, cuckoos, the darkness and the harsh cry of a buck with newly sprouted horns. Pass through the red Shinto gate. At the far end of the grounds is a wall the color of a sea slug. Used carelessly, they rot in people's hands or die. Words and a portion of flesh, living things, at the far end of a cave, at the tip of a flame. Today I have done nothing, nothing at all. That which occurs on earth ends on earth. The sea slug image, by the way, doesn't sound as awful in Japanese as it does in English. Sea slugs are not such terrible critters in Japanese. Let's see. Okay. Most of the poetry, I think most of the Fresno poets are very interested in story, in the poem being a story, in a sense, a description or commentary on experience. But the poetry here isn't really a story. I mean, in a sense, there may be a story somewhere down there, sort of hidden or somewhere between the lines. It's kind of like an archaeology, or a series of sediments. You go in and you find a broken shard, a piece of pottery, and over here you find another object, and over here you find something else, a piece of writing, an ancient character, or something. And you have to piece these together yourself. It's a series of fragments that no one can tell you exactly what's going on. It's you find out what's going on through this series of fragments and these series of discoveries. This is the title poem, Kusudama. There's some images of the chrysanthemums and various other things that make one feel that Ryosuke may be commenting on the imperial family, or perhaps on certain aspects of Japanese history. Within a hedge fragrant with chrysanthemums, the banquet has begun. Grandfather slits a chicken's throat, and grandmother soaks a mouse nearby. My father has carried the spirits of the ancestors to a grassy riverbed and questions, voice raised. What is it mother carries of her own will? The neighbors glance furtively. Undoubtedly bathed in light, she employs a pair of large testicles. Raise 3 cheers and sing the national anthem. My sister, all dressed up like a battleship, bites into a plum. Its simplified interior throbs. The crimson gate opens onto the world. Beyond a plate of brass, the one dying is my elder brother. The darkening of a far-off field in spring, with heat waves oscillating, grows like fingers of bracken. This is my little sister. Anyone would feel like applauding. The night the family line is set straight, and banquet trays set straight in a row, I toddle all through the house, and secretly desire a daddy longlegs. A model of the family's bodies is complete, divided into blue, yellow, and red. Its most sublime points still shine like gold. A portrait of the Emperor Jinmu. A cry rings out. The kusudama has split open, and the sacred farm implements lost in the mundane. I cut the water inside the pot with a sickle and shout for it to retain its severed surface. The autumn of disastrous St. Elmo's fires. My father stops vomiting. Look out the bay window and drop tears onto the rocks. One great hawk, a brandished fuse. Within a circle which passes into infinity, The plump ridge of Shepwreck's belly can be seen. Waves, waves, semen shed. Static electricity is produced in the inner wall of a jellyfish, which swims around the belly of a pregnant woman and sinks into the swirling waves. Sense exchange, irradiation, peeling, termination, the sound and raw smell of death. O merciful Buddha, I am unable to conclude that this was my sister. Certainly at dawn, a diamond-shaped piece of land filled with the dead will be found. Sipping up their bowls of hot soup, mother and little sister cheerfully set out to pick chamomile flowers. On the periphery of the sundry goods is a deep blue garden, where swans float dreamily. A man can be seen screaming in the flames. A bundle of sutras are folded up. Horned serpent is held hotly in his hand. Sentences studded with diamonds and word spirits. Clipping off the chill dried leaves, mother and sister venture toward the cliffs. Look at their cat feet. A winter mist enshrouds them. I am fighting from day to day, figuratively speaking, or calligraphically. The enemy may be hiding in a snow dugout. Language, or form, on top of some fresh straw. Several eggs have been laid and left behind. Something of mine. I was thinking of reading that the Fresno poem. I've been working on a long poem for a number of years. Which, in a sense, like Yoshioka, is a kind of an archaeology, or a series of fragments or small pieces. It's called Transparencies. Transparencies being, those little clear pieces of film you place under the light, and you get a picture up on the wall there. This is like a series of these pictures, of these images. The subtitle of the poem could, in a sense, be The Theater of Memory, which actually there was a theater of memory. It was a contraption being built by this crazy guy during the Renaissance in the 1500s. It wasn't that crazy. He was right on in a lot of ways, but it was kind of a physical mandala in the shape of a classical theater that one could enter. Felt that one could have contact with all knowledge, all spiritual knowledge would be placed in this theater and compartmentalized. In a sense, it's a primitive computer. It contains the memory, right? It's artificial memory. One stands on the stage in the classical theater and looks at the seats, which are spread out in this manner and are organized according to the zodiac. And all of human knowledge and understanding is placed in all these various compartments. And quite a lot of people were fascinated with that idea during the Renaissance. He never completed his project. He was one of the most promising men of his generation. He never really completed anything. It's really fascinating because it's just pure potential. Nothing was ever really done. It was potential. But this, I have an interest in history and so on, and amongst other things, I'm interested in so many things. Everything gets in the poem, but this one has a lot to do with Fresno and Fresno history. It begins with a quote. It's the second movement of Transparencies, parts 8 through 12. Each stanza has 12 lines, Each line, theoretically at least, has 7 syllables, although I break my rules a lot. And each section of the poem has 7 stanzas. So the numbers do have a certain significance. It begins with a quote from St. Augustine's Confessions. "And I come to the fields and spacious palaces of my memory, where are the treasures of innumerable images, brought into it from things of all sorts, perceived by the senses. Solemn was his dwelling in the shadow of the tree, mirror-like his face. The homeless, windswept landscape, we are, in threes, these 3 here, the tree. And wait him then to go down in the cave, a condominium, television and all comforts. Hell is a nice place after all, drinks and salted nuts, occasionally a face. This internal crystal, inset jewel encased in black, no one sees. A reflection is what is seen, called clarity, but not the thing. The mirror is gone, man is gone, only seeing. The waiting and the falling back, around, sounds confused, still. The seed planted. Growth is terrible, how it twists, spurns, turns away. No clarity here, but dark pitch earth, encrusted layers of mineral and rock. This tiny seed, trembling live in its thick bed. Now we come to memory, its ritual calls, internal flaws, eternal, untapped. Whisked out of childhood, it returns there. Combs, crossbeam, screw and saw, at touch of hand. Things which do not exist, have existed, have come and left. The extension of a set, a perfect triangle. Voice of stone interiorized, the frozen surfaces, moments, occasions, lifted up out and out to the recycling air. All this imagined, how the past has more clarity, is more real. Form is shadow, and shadow form, this tiny seed. The ash-colored land cut off from the sea, where meadowlark and mockingbird sang simultaneously, where the river flowed and men found peace, found food and the good things the earth will give, all rotten, all spent, the waters held back, this dryness and chemical death, called progress, called success. The Fresno tree, ash in a deep pond, a low place by the river, the forgotten one. Gray branches, hard wood, opposite pinnate leaves, purplish flowers in small clusters. How this would attract the new powers in Sacramento and San Francisco. Railroads, cash crop, irrigation, the dam, then the immigrants from Asia and Armenia to live here. The body of the tree, the fig's swollen sides turned crimson, openings that bring in light, green curtain to shut out darkness. These tools put in the hand to carve a daily existence. Stone axe, fire stick, bow and blade, extensions of the imagination into flesh of plant, animal, and earth. This map of the mind, of labyrinthine journey through the day-to-day. Map of the dream, its circular way through ravines and up slopes, always returning to another place. A poetry of objects placed near to one. Intimacy is of the glands, the biological institution. Something beyond the self, as it is forgotten on crossing paths in the new snow. The season changes. The fig's rubbery leaves shrivel to brown rags in winter. The trunk a gray stub plopped heavily into the valley fog. Now spring light is more resilient. comes earlier over the purpled hills and pulls the green cigar shoots out of the softened flesh of the tree. A sticky leaf, like a canopy over its short base, in some places oozing a thick sap. The night and again the night, the impossibility of connecting. Where is the way where light dwells, great clusters of grapes, as when gathered they came to the valley to farm, for the orchards and the canals, for safe haven away from sword, horsemen, Ottoman Turks, away from history. The Armenians in Fresno, 1895, and their crops burgeoned. Packing away the autumn fruits, the ladies with their thick fingers, nimble, old world, caressing apple, pear, and quince for good pay, better than a man. These relics of the valley, dried and tart like their birthplace, apricot, prune, peach, raisin, sent away with the railroad, sent in big crates to big cities, growth as industry, and the past fading in the evening gloom. Growth and decay, how all things tend towards certain shapes. The drop, the ripple, fine crystals, contour of green pepper or eggplant, all related in structure and form, their cells following an inner map, the pull and necessity of Earth's own movement and shape, like a large drop, and how all things which gather dissipate. We have come full circle, the tide years span. Entering the house, music emerges from the paneled walls. The world is populated with usable objects, figurines, utensils, tiny gods. And she went into the tree and became the tree, became a house, inhabits memory. All must enter here, the dwelling that is the heart, gathering the ripened fruits. Perhaps an olive grove, that branch which held allows to see, while those who forget pass beyond another river. To be born is endless. Sorrow fills like an earthen vase, as the stomach sickens. The perineum is sad, leaps out the mouth, the transformed being, which is pain. This is a holy place, all overgrown with laurels, vines, and olives. The poison seeps in on E Street, down to the Greyhound, near the tracks, this tunnel reaching out to the city as it spreads flat across the dry. Poison in grapes, in the southern Pacific, poison that eats the brains of the Mexican migrants, that fills the jeweled swimming pools of the rich. And saw the land, at that time commanded about $12 per acre, also planted about 15 acres in fruit trees, but at that time there were no canneries. Only a very few of the choicest fruit trees were retained, white mies, mataro, and numerous other choice varieties. The sink of Fancher Creek that for ages deposited the red oxidated iron silt from the Sierra, like a map spread out before the eye. Californix, Californo, hot furnace, high hills. Surfaces, resurfaces, McKinley to Shaw, Olive, Belmont, Divisadero, Stanislaw. The map does not essentially change. Center at Fulton and Mariposa, farm colonies surrounding, mountains in view at all times. Intensity of light reflected off flat land leads to astigma, fertilizer and dust to allergies. People living in history don't know what's happening to them. Beyond memory, a wheel turning on itself. A man becomes again in perpetual repetition the same man. These meanings to shift, memorativa. Branch made into bow, changing of the season, of what food can be found, pine nuts in fall, deer in winter. Spring brings acorns to make meal, knowledge from ground, beyond speech. Tule for construction of huts, balsas and rafts, rivers, lakes, marshes provide habitats for pelican, cormorant, avocet, plover, gull, heron, tern, duck, grebe, bittern, geese, curlew, and snipe. From rivers come also mussels and a species of suckers, a narrative in nature, a prehistory, possibly 50 tribes in the Tulare Lake Basin in the south. Another line also started at the depot, went up Mariposa to Kay and to Tulare, then traveling east on Tulare to its terminus, another to Belmont Avenue on the edge of the plains, the Fresno, Belmont, and Yosemite Railroad, crossings and recrossings. The heart is a terminal, a reservoir, the tribal economy and the terrain, bringing the point into a point. Shifting of foci, Sir O, dead, Saya dead, Skylark and Emperor, all dead. History passes before their faces like a bridge, a large break in the continental skin. Fancy the holes, the ashes, small boats of yarrow stalks and eggplant, columbine, holly hung at the door. Each pushing a shopping cart, precariously overloaded with old bottles and cans down Gary Street, the threshold, all these things falling back into themselves, delineated. The world has passed. Delphinium in tall clusters, one prolonged into a conspicuous spur, variously colored, common and poisonous. The city is a labyrinth, mouth open like an inverted helix, running downward the tongue of history weighing down, the face he had before he was born. The return is most difficult over long stretches of highway, ground burned in sun, ragged flowers of ornamentals, 99, 140, 5, 580, the elliptical series. A closed plane curve generated by a point, moving in such a way that the sums of its distances from two fixed points is a constant, used as a highway divider and light screen for freeways, Nerium oleander, leaves in threes or opposite, flowers pink, rose, white, corolla funnel-shaped, toxic part, entire plant. The sickness soon develops, distancing, separation, the form of history, the way a shape in the sunlight makes its own shadow. The larger telegel panes rest in the doctor's body, enveloped in a blanket of something like slime, not bigger than a finger and often less. Finally, I could take them out of myself, this eye a product of matter, slipping back, sucking the wound. Finally, entering the cave itself, they found some small children. The hero of the occasion, being a humane man, could not bear to kill these babies, at any rate not with the heavy 56 caliber Spencer rifle he was carrying. It tore them up too bad. So he shot them with his 38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. Mill Creek, April 1871. Then she dreamed she saw the sky rising and blood dripping off its edge. Immediately followed the Kala'a, first night of dance, curious movements with their hands, obliquely on each side several long dark feathers, wailing and sobbing, the door tightly closed and a gourd placed beside it. I began with a dream. I was ill, filling my basket with dentalia, pounding to a large hole. There is something remembered, various pains flying above the heads of the people, wild sage to soothe the throat. My thinking was flawed. Could all this erase, each step folding in on itself? A way to live, the stories perhaps, all dead. There a large house stood on the ice with many human beings in and around it. From below the waters moved up, surrounding, impossible to push back. 1964, on this spot, the inability to understand, the terror of history. Of the survival of image, the underground spring bubbling up from below Mariposa Street, years later, it gives back to them. It is the mask, mask within mask, embodiment. Where can we go now, away from ourselves, farther in along this huge river system, shedding, Shedding the skin, I becomes other, to build a house inside of this, my body. In a grove of oak lies the opening, a gap from the mute skin of the earth. Here our hero, a Yokut's man, steps down as if into the vast structure of recollection. It is the dead in ourselves, the valley oak's small leaves chattering over the gentle slopes of the lower Sierra, voices of the dead, bird mirror, frost. The ground, which is the first shield in the world, beckons, opens to that branch of the old tree. He follows his wife, who, as if in sleep, has set out walking toward the other world. He follows her until he comes to a stream crossed by a bridge that constantly shakes and moves. Through me you go into the city of weeping. Through me you go into eternal pain. At the end of the bridge, a great bird screams and readies its talons to tear the new souls to pieces. But the man carries a talisman, a magic rope, and succeeds in crossing to the other side. There he finds his wife with a crowd of the dead dancing the round dance. The banquet of the dead. The lord of the underworld invites the shaman to wage a contest against sleep, and if he can stay awake one night, he may take his wife with him back to the world of the living. The round dance begins, but he does not take part, thinking to save his energy for the long night's vigil. He bathes and goes to bed with his wife. They spend the night chatting. But just before dawn, the man falls asleep. He awakens with a rotten log in his arms. The inner fields of the body. A mouth opening at the stomach, the recesses of the dance. A bloodletting, the invention of history. Take, eat, this is my body, jutting into time. Take this my scatteredness, and I become like the land. Memoria, contuitus, expectatio, to fill. Carried across that light, impassable distance. Here in the city, smaller lights, electricity, gas stove, stew to warm us, and we wait for arrival. There is life within complexity, small joy, embrace, salvation in time's passing.
Maybe we could take a little 7th inning stretch here.